Don't
Nice.
speak. Don't move, Zuri whispered, her voice trembling yet firm, as her hand pressed gently over Archibald Warrington's mouth in the shadowed foyer. The storm roared outside the billionaire's opulent New York estate, its howling winds masking a deeper menace lurking within. Zuri, the gardener with radiant dark skin and cascading, wavy hair, wasn't supposed to be there after hours, yet her terrified eyes held a secret that would unravel everything. Welcome to a tale where courage blooms in the unlikeliest of hearts, and a single night reshapes a family forever. Stay until the end to discover how one woman's hidden strength turns a cold mansion into a home. If this grips you, hit that subscribe button and share where you're listening from, day or night, city or countryside. Let's dive into a story that will leave you breathless. The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing at the edges of the Warrington estate, its gusts rattling the tall arched windows of the mansion. Rain lashed the glass in relentless sheets, blurring the world beyond into a smear of gray and shadow. Archibald Warrington, billionaire titan of New York's real estate empire, stepped out of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the wet gravel. The storm had turned the night into a living thing, wild and unyielding, and Archibald, in his tailored tuxedo, felt its weight pressing against his already frayed nerves. He waved off his driver, a curt gesture, and trudged toward the grand oak doors of his home, craving nothing more than silence after a night of hollow gala speeches and clinking champagne glasses. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of darkness, the chandelier overhead unlit, its crystals glinting faintly from distant lightning. Archibald fumbled with his keys, the jangle swallowed by the storm's roar. He was bone-tired, his shoulders stiff from hours of forced smiles and handshakes with men whose wealth he dwarfed, but whose company he loathed. The gala had been a parade of egos, a glittering cage of imported wines and calculated donations, and he had slipped out early, leaving behind a check large enough to silence the charity board's whispers. All he wanted now was a glass of bourbon, the leather embrace of his study chair, and the quiet he paid so dearly for in this sprawling, empty mansion. But the silence he craved was not there. As he shut the heavy door behind him, a hand shot out from the shadows, clamping over his mouth with startling force. His body stiffened, adrenaline spiking, his fist curling instinctively to strike. A woman's voice, low and trembling, hissed in his ear. "Don't speak, don't move." The words were a command wrapped in fear, and they froze him. His pulse hammered, eyes darting in the dim light. The hand was warm, calloused, not the soft grip of a thief, but something else. Something desperate. He twisted slightly and the hand released him, allowing him to turn. "Zuri?" he whispered, voice sharp with disbelief. Zuri, the gardener, stood before him, her radiant dark skin glistening with rain, her long, wavy black hair plastered to her face and shoulders. She wasn't in her usual khaki work clothes, but a soaked sweater and jeans, her eyes wide with a fear that made his stomach lurch. She was 28, young enough to be overlooked, old enough to carry a quiet strength he'd never noticed. Her presence in his foyer at this hour was as jarring as the storm outside. "What the hell are you doing here?" Archibald hissed, yanking his tie loose, his voice low but edged with fury. He barely knew her. Zuri was just the woman who kept his gardens pristine, her name a footnote in the payroll he never reviewed. She was invisible to him, like the maids or cooks, her work a backdrop to his life. But tonight, her eyes were anything but invisible, glistening with something that wasn't just fear, but resolve. "Please," Zuri said, her voice steady despite its softness, "don't raise your voice." She glanced toward the grand staircase, its polished mahogany vanishing into the darkness of the upper floors. Her hands trembled, but she stood her ground, a lone figure against the opulence of the foyer. "Why shouldn't I?" Archibald snapped, stepping closer, his shadow looming over her. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, used to commanding rooms. But Zuri didn't flinch. Her chin lifted, and her gaze held his, unyielding. "Because there's someone in the house," she whispered, her words slicing through the air like a blade. "And if you make a sound, you could put Beatrice in danger." Archibald froze, the name of his 8-year-old daughter hitting him like a physical blow. Beatrice, his quiet, delicate girl, was asleep upstairs, or so he assumed. He hadn't checked on her in days, maybe weeks, his life a blur of meetings and private jets. The thought of her in danger made his throat tighten, his earlier irritation dissolving into a cold dread. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper now. Zuri's eyes darted to the staircase again, then back to him. "I've been hearing things for weeks. Whispers, footsteps in empty rooms. Things moved when no one's around. Tonight I saw someone, a shadow up there, near her room. I stayed late to make sure she was safe." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the weight she carried. Archibald's mind raced. He wanted to dismiss her, to call it nonsense, but the raw fear in her eyes held him captive. Zuri wasn't supposed to be here. Her job was daylight hours, trimming roses, shaping hedges, not skulking in his foyer at midnight. Yet here she was, soaked and shivering, risking her place in his household to warn him. He didn't know her story, not really, but he'd heard fragments from the staff. Zuri, the black woman from the city's roughest corners, who'd clawed her way through night school to study landscape design. The other workers, all white, didn't hide their disdain. Earlier that day, he'd overheard them in the kitchen, their voices sharp with mockery as they called her the dirt girl, snickering as they spilled coffee grounds on her freshly swept patio. Zuri had been there, head down, sweeping the mess without a word, her face a mask of quiet endurance. She'd looked tired, maybe hurt, but she'd kept working, her hands steady on the broom, her focus on the garden she loved. Now standing in his foyer, she was no longer the invisible gardener. She was a woman who'd seen something he hadn't, who'd stayed when she could have left. "Why didn't you call security?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost pleading. Zuri's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't trust them. Not after what I've seen. Someone's been leaving the back gate unlocked, and I don't think it's an accident." Her words were measured, but they carried a weight that made his skin prickle. She stepped closer, her voice dropping lower. "I've been watching, Mr. Warrington. I know this house better than most. Something's wrong." Lightning flashed, illuminating her face for a moment, her dark eyes fierce with determination. Archibald felt a pang of shame. He hadn't noticed her. Not really until this moment. The gardens she tended were his pride, a showcase for guests, but he'd never thought about the hands that shaped them. Now those hands had stopped him, held him, and were pointing him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. A distant creak echoed from the upper floors, sharp against the storm's roar. Zuri's head snapped toward the sound, her body tensing. Archibald followed her gaze, his heart pounding. The mansion, once a symbol of his triumph, felt like a labyrinth now, its shadows hiding threats he couldn't see. He thought of Beatrice, her small frame curled under her blankets, unaware of the danger Zuri claimed was near. His hands clenched, the weight of his absence as a father pressing down on him. He'd been gone too long, too often, leaving her to nannies and tutors while he chased deals across continents. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the staircase. But Zuri grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she whispered fiercely. "We go together, or we don't go at all. I'm not letting you walk into this alone." Archibald stared at her, torn between indignation and gratitude. She was a gardener, a stranger in his world, yet she stood ready to face whatever lurked upstairs. The storm raged on, its fury a mirror to the chaos in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of something other than money, a responsibility to his daughter, and a debt to the woman who dared to stop him in the dark. The air in the Warrington mansion was thick with the scent of rain-soaked wood and the faint tang of wax from forgotten candles. The storm outside battered the estate, its relentless drumming a stark contrast to the oppressive silence within. Archibald Warrington stood frozen at the base of the grand staircase, his heart still racing from Zuri's whispered warning. Her words, "Someone in the house," a shadow near Beatrice's room, clung to him like a damp cloth. Zuri, the gardener, stood a step behind, her soaked sweater clinging to her frame, her dark eyes scanning the darkness above. The chandelier swayed slightly, its crystals catching flickers of lightning, casting jagged shadows that danced across the marble floor. "We can't stay here," Zuri murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. She gestured toward the library, a heavy oak door just off the foyer. "It's safer there. We need to talk." Her tone was urgent, but there was a steadiness to it, a resolve that made Archibald's own uncertainty feel like a betrayal of his daughter upstairs. He nodded, his throat tight, and followed her, his polished shoes clicking softly on the floor. The library was a cavern of bookshelves and leather, its air heavy with the must of old pages. Zuri closed the door behind them, the click of the latch sounding final in the dimness. A single candelabra flickered on a side table, its weak light barely reaching the towering shelves. She'd lit it earlier, Archibald realized, as if she'd been preparing for this moment. He leaned against a mahogany desk, his tuxedo rumpled, and fixed his gaze on her. "Explain," he said, his voice low but sharp. "What did you see, and why are you here, in my house, at this hour?" Zuri's hands tightened into fists, her wavy hair dripping onto the Persian rug. "I've been hearing things for weeks," she began, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fear. Whispers in the halls at dusk, footsteps in rooms that should be empty, objects moved when no one's around. A vase in the parlor shifted 3 inches left one night. Next, a chair in the dining room was turned toward the window. Small things, but not accidents. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "Tonight, I was locking up the greenhouse when I saw a shadow on the second floor near Beatrice's room. It moved fast, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. I saw a glint, maybe a knife, maybe something worse." Archibald's chest tightened. Beatrice, his 8-year-old daughter, was asleep up there, her small frame lost in the vastness of her canopied bed. Or was she? The thought made his stomach churn. "Why didn't you call the police?" he demanded, his voice rising before he caught himself and lowered it. "Or security. I have a team for this." Zuri's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze unwavering. "Because I don't trust them. Not after what I've seen." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The back gate's been left unlocked 3 nights this week. I check it every evening before I leave. It's part of my routine. Someone's been tampering with it, Mr. Warrington. Someone inside this house." The accusation hung in the air, heavy as the storm outside. Archibald's mind reeled. His staff, maids, cooks, the head of security, were vetted, loyal, or so he'd thought. But he hadn't been home enough to know them, not really. His life was a blur of boardrooms and private jets, leaving Beatrice to nannies and tutors. The idea that someone in his employ could betray him, could threaten his daughter, felt like a blade twisting in his gut. "Who?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Who do you suspect?" Zuri hesitated, her eyes flicking to the door as if expecting it to burst open. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but the head housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, has been acting strange. She's been locking doors early, avoiding the east wing, and I caught her watching the security monitors late one night when she thought no one was around. It's not proof, but it's enough to make me stay. I couldn't leave Beatrice alone." Archibald stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Zuri, the gardener he'd barely noticed, had been watching his home, his daughter, more closely than he ever had. He remembered the whispers of the staff, their cruel jabs at her. The dirt girl, they called her, mocking her calloused hands and the soil under her nails. He'd overheard them that morning, their voices sharp as they laughed over spilled coffee grounds on her pristine patio. Zuri had swept it up, her face tight with restrained hurt, her focus returning to the roses she tended with a care that bordered on reverence. She'd grown up in the city's roughest corners, he'd heard, scraping by on odd jobs, from cleaning houses to selling flowers on street corners, all to fun night classes in landscape design. Her resilience was etched in her posture now, in the way she stood tall despite the storm and the danger. "Why you?" he asked almost to himself. "Why risk this? You're not paid to play security." Zuri's gaze softened, but there was a fire behind it. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," she said quietly. "I grew up waiting for my mother to come home from double shifts, listening to every creak in the apartment, wondering if it was her or something worse. Beatrice doesn't deserve to feel that kind of fear, not in her own home." Her words cut deeper than Archibald expected, stirring a guilt he hadn't faced in years. He thought of Beatrice, her quiet voice and wide eyes, the way she clung to her stuffed rabbit when he left for another trip. He hadn't been there, not for bedtime stories, not for her school plays. He'd assumed his wealth, his name, would protect her. But Zuri, earning less in a month than he spent on a single dinner, had seen what he hadn't. A sudden crack of thunder shook the house, and the candelabra flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. Zuri's head snapped toward the door, her body tensing like a coiled spring. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Archibald strained his ears, the storm's roar making it hard to discern anything. Then it came, a soft thud, like a footstep, from the hallway beyond. His heart lurched. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the door, but Zuri grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "We don't split up. If someone's out there, we face it together." Her eyes burned with a determination that made him pause. She wasn't just the gardener anymore. She was a force, a woman who'd survived more than he could imagine, standing between his daughter and whatever lurked in the dark. He nodded, his throat tight, and followed her to the door. Zuri pressed her ear against the wood, listening, then eased it open, the hinges creaking softly. The foyer was empty, but the air felt charged, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Lightning flashed, illuminating the staircase, and for a moment, Archibald thought he saw a shadow shift at the top, fleeting but unmistakable. Zuri's hand tightened on his arm, her breath hitching. "They're still here," she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and resolve. "And they're close." The library's air was thick with the scent of old leather and wax, the candelabra's flame flickering like a heartbeat in the storm's relentless assault. Archibald Warrington leaned against the heavy mahogany desk, his tuxedo creased, his mind a tangle of fear and disbelief. Zuri stood opposite him, her soaked sweater clinging to her frame, her long, wavy black hair dripping onto the Persian rug. Her dark eyes, radiant even in the dim light, held a fierce resolve that made the sprawling Warrington mansion feel smaller, more fragile. The storm outside roared, its thunder shaking the walls. But it was Zuri's words, someone inside the house, a shadow near Beatrice's room, that echoed louder in Archibald's chest. His daughter, his quiet, fragile Beatrice, was upstairs, and the thought of her in danger clawed at him. Zuri's voice broke the silence, low and steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've been watching this house, Mr. Warrington. Things aren't right." She glanced at the library door, as if expecting it to burst open. "Mrs. Caldwell, the head housekeeper, has been off, locking doors at odd hours, avoiding the east wing, lingering by the security monitors when she thinks no one's looking. I don't have proof, but I know what I've seen." Archibald's jaw tightened. Mrs. Caldwell had been with the family for a decade, her stern efficiency a fixture in the mansion. The idea that she could be involved in something sinister felt absurd, yet Zuri's certainty gnawed at him. "Why would she do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "She's trusted, vetted." Zuri's lips pressed into a thin line. "Trust can be bought or broken." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've lived in places where you learn to read people, Mr. Warrington. Growing up, I didn't have the luxury of assuming everyone was honest. You learn to notice the small things, the way someone's eyes dart, the way they move when they think no one's watching. Mrs. Caldwell's hiding something." Archibald stared at her, the weight of her words settling like lead. He hadn't noticed Zuri before. Not really. She was the gardener, a shadow in his periphery, her hands always stained with soil, her presence confined to the roses and hedges that made his estate the envy of his peers. But now in the flickering candlelight, he saw her differently. Her radiant dark skin, her unwavering gaze, the quiet strength that seemed to anchor the room. He remembered the staff's cruelty, their mocking whispers calling her the dirt girl, their deliberate spills on her pristine patio. That morning, he'd seen her sweeping up their mess, her face tight with restrained hurt, her focus returning to the garden she tended with a care that bordered on sacred. She'd grown up in the city's roughest corners, he'd heard, scraping by on odd jobs, from cleaning houses to selling flowers, all to fund night classes in landscape design. Her resilience was etched in her posture now, in the way she stood tall despite the storm and the danger. "Why you?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. Why risk your neck for my daughter? Zuri's gaze softened, but there was a fire behind it. Because I know what it's like to be alone, she said quietly. My mother worked double shifts, cleaning offices, scrubbing floors. I'd sit by the door, listening for her key, praying it wasn't someone else. The world's not kind to kids left alone, Mr. Warrington. Beatrice doesn't deserve that fear. Not here, not in her own home. Her words cut deeper than he expected, stirring a guilt he'd buried under years of boardroom victories. Archibald thought of Beatrice, her wide eyes, her quiet voice, the way she clutched her stuffed rabbit when he left for another trip. He'd been gone too often, leaving her to nannies and tutors, assuming his wealth would shield her. But Zuri, earning less in a month than he spent on a single dinner, had seen what he hadn't. She'd stayed, risking her safety, because she cared. A sudden crack of thunder shook the house, the candelabra's flames sputtering, casting wild shadows across the bookshelves. Zuri's head snapped toward the ceiling, her body tensing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. Archibald strained his ears, the wind's howl making it hard to discern anything. Then it came, a faint creak, like a floorboard under weight, from the hallway above. His heart lurched, his mind flashing to Beatrice, asleep in her canopied bed. Or was she? The thought made his stomach churn. He moved toward the door, but Zuri's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "We don't rush in blind. If someone's up there, we need a plan." Her eyes burned with a determination that made him pause. She wasn't just a gardener. She was a survivor, her instincts honed by years of navigating a world that had tried to break her. Archibald nodded, his throat tight. "What's your plan?" he asked, his voice low, almost deferential. It was a tone he rarely used, one reserved for equals, not staff. But Zuri had earned it. She glanced around the library, her eyes settling on a letter opener on the desk, a slim silver blade, more decorative than deadly, but better than nothing. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Keep this close," she said. "We check the security room first. The monitors might show us where they are. If we're lucky, we can lock them out before they get to Beatrice." Archibald gripped the letter opener, its weight grounding him. He thought of his daughter, her small frame lost in the vastness of her room, and a surge of protectiveness flooded him. He'd been absent too long, leaving her to strangers while he chased deals across continents. Now a stranger, a woman he'd barely noticed, was the one standing between Beatrice and danger. Zuri moved to the door, pressing her ear against it, listening. The storm raged on, its fury a mirror to the chaos in Archibald's chest. He thought of his last deal, a bitter fallout with a rival, Victor Crane, who'd sworn revenge after losing a prime Manhattan property to Archibald's bid. Crane's threats had seemed empty at the time, the posturing of a bruised ego. But now in the dark, with Zuri's warning ringing in his ears, they felt all too real. Zuri eased the door open, the hinges creaking softly. The foyer was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy with unspoken menace. Lightning flashed, illuminating the grand staircase, and for a moment, Archibald thought he saw a shadow shift at the top, a fleeting shape, too quick to be sure. Zuri's breath hitched, her hand tightening on the candelabra she now held. "They're close," she whispered, her voice a mix of fear and resolve. "We need to move. Now." Archibald followed her, his heart pounding, the letter opener clutched tightly in his hand. The mansion, once a symbol of his triumph, felt like a trap now, its shadows hiding threats he couldn't see. Zuri led the way, her steps silent but sure, her instincts guiding them through the darkness. For the first time, Archibald realized he wasn't leading. He was following, trusting a woman whose strength he'd never bothered to see until now. The Warrington mansion groaned under the storm's relentless assault, its walls shuddering as thunder cracked like a whip. The grand staircase loomed before Archibald Warrington and Zuri, its polished mahogany steps swallowed by shadows that seemed to pulse with malice. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of rain and the faint, acrid scent of fear. Archibald clutched the silver letter opener Zuri had given him, its weight a frail anchor against the dread coiling in his chest. Zuri, her radiant dark skin glistening with rain, held the candelabra aloft, its flickering flame casting jagged pools of light. Her long, wavy black hair clung to her shoulders, but her eyes burned with a fierce determination that made the sprawling estate feel less like a fortress and more like a battlefield. They moved up the staircase in silence, each step deliberate, the creak of the wood masked by the storm's roar. Zuri led, her movements fluid yet cautious, her gardener's hands steady despite the danger. Archibald followed, his heart pounding with the image of Beatrice, his 8-year-old daughter, alone in her room, or worse. Zuri's warning, someone in the house, a shadow with a weapon, had rooted itself in his mind, each word a thorn. He'd been absent too long, leaving Beatrice to nannies and a staff he barely knew, assuming his wealth could shield her. Now the mansion's opulence felt like a mockery, its grandeur hiding threats he'd never imagined. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness, its walls lined with portraits of Warrington ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch their every move. Zuri paused, her breath shallow, and pointed toward Beatrice's room at the far end. The door was ajar, a sliver of shadow spilling out like ink. Archibald's stomach churned, his grip tightening on the letter opener. "Stay close," Zuri whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind howling through a cracked window somewhere down the hall. They crept forward, the carpet muffling their steps. The storm's flashes illuminated the hallway in staccato bursts, revealing glimpses of gilded frames and ornate sconces. As they neared Beatrice's door, Archibald's heart sank. The room was empty, her canopied bed a tangle of sheets, her stuffed rabbit lying abandoned on the floor. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice breaking, the letter opener trembling in his hand. Zuri's hand grazed his arm, grounding him. "Listen," she hissed. A faint sound, a muffled whimper, came from above, sharp and fleeting. The attic. Archibald's eyes met Zuri's, her gaze fierce with resolve. "The stairs are at the end of the hall," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I know the way. Follow me." She moved with a purpose that belied her gardener's role, her knowledge of the mansion's labyrinthine layout, a testament to her quiet vigilance. Archibald followed, his mind racing. He thought of Zuri's past, her childhood in the city's roughest corners, scraping by on odd jobs to fund her dreams of landscape design. She'd faced dangers he couldn't fathom, her instincts honed by years of survival. The staff's cruelty, calling her the dirt girl, spilling coffee grounds on her pristine patio, hadn't broken her. She'd swept up their mess, her face tight with restrained hurt, her focus on the garden she loved. Now that same resilience guided them through the dark. The attic stairs were narrow, tucked behind a panel in the east wing. Zuri eased the panel open, the hinges groaning softly. The air grew colder as they ascended, the storm's roar louder, as if the house itself were screaming. Dust motes danced in the candelabra's light, and the scent of mildew clung to the walls. At the top, a single door stood, its paint peeling like old skin. Zuri pressed her ear against it, her breath hitching. "She's in there," she whispered. "I hear her." Before Archibald could respond, a muffled scream pierced the silence. Beatrice's voice, small and terrified. His blood ran cold and he lunged for the door, but Zuri grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. "Wait," she hissed. "We don't know what's waiting. We need to be smart." Her eyes darted to the candelabra, then to a pair of garden shears tucked into her belt, a tool she'd carried from her work in the greenhouse. She handed the candelabra to Archibald and drew the shears, their blades glinting dully. Archibald nodded, his throat tight. Together they pushed the door open, the hinges shrieking in protest. The attic was a cavern of shadows, cluttered with old trunks and forgotten furniture, the storm's flashes piercing through a cracked skylight. In the far corner, illuminated by a single lightning strike, stood a masked figure, tall, clad in black, a knife gleaming in one hand. Beatrice knelt before him, her small hands bound, her eyes wide with terror. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice a knife in Archibald's heart. "Stay back," the figure growled, his voice muffled but menacing, the knife hovering near Beatrice's throat. Archibald froze, the letter opener useless in his trembling hand. His wealth, his power, meant nothing here. The figure's eyes, visible through the masked slits, glinted with cold intent. You should have stayed out of Crane's way, Warrington, he said, confirming Archibald's worst fear. Victor Crane, his vengeful rival, had sent this man to destroy him. Zuri stepped forward, her shears raised, her voice steady despite the danger. "Let her go," she said, her tone commanding. "You don't want to do this." The figure laughed, a harsh, grating sound, but Zuri didn't flinch. She moved closer, her movement slow but deliberate, her eyes locked on the intruders. Archibald watched, his heart pounding, marveling at her courage. She was a gardener, paid to tend roses, yet here she was, facing a killer with nothing but her wits and a pair of shears. The figure lunged, his knife arcing toward Zuri, but she was faster. She ducked, swinging the shears in a wide arc, catching his sleeve and tearing it. The man cursed, stumbling back, and Archibald seized the moment. He dove for Beatrice, scooping her into his arms and rolling behind a trunk. The girl clung to him, sobbing, her small frame trembling. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, cutting her bonds with the letter opener. "I'm here." Zuri circled the intruder, her shears flashing as she parried another strike. The storm's roar masked the clash of metal, but her movements were precise, honed by years of wielding tools in the garden. She feinted left, then swung right, catching the man's arm. He howled, dropping the knife, and Zuri kicked it across the floor. "Run!" she shouted to Archibald, her voice cutting through the chaos. Archibald hesitated, torn between fleeing with Beatrice and helping Zuri, but her eyes met his, fierce and unwavering, and he knew she could handle this. He lifted Beatrice, her small arms wrapping around his neck, and ran for the stairs, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and gratitude. Zuri had given him a chance to save his daughter, and he wouldn't waste it. As he reached the stairs, he glanced back. Zuri stood over the intruder, now on his knees, her shears at his throat. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face, radiant, resolute, a woman who'd turned her pain into power. The attic door slammed shut behind him, the storm's fury swallowing the sound of struggle. But Archibald knew Zuri had won this round. For Beatrice, for him, she'd face the darkness head-on. The Warrington mansion seemed to hold its breath as the storm's fury softened to a low, mournful howl. Archibald Warrington stumbled down the attic stairs, his daughter Beatrice clutched tightly in his arms, her small frame trembling against his chest. Her sobs were muffled, her face buried in his rumpled tuxedo, her tiny hands gripping his collar, as if afraid he'd vanish. The letter opener he'd used to cut her bonds slipped from his fingers, clattering on the mahogany steps, its silver glint lost in the shadows. His heart pounded, not just from the terror of the confrontation, but from the weight of Zuri's sacrifice. She was still up there, facing the masked intruder alone, her garden shears her only weapon. Archibald's throat tightened with a mix of gratitude and guilt. He'd left her to fight his battle, a gardener against a killer. He reached the second-floor hallway, the storm's flashes casting eerie light through the tall windows. Beatrice whimpered, "Daddy, is Zuri okay?" Her voice, small and fragile, cut through him. He kissed her forehead, his lips brushing her damp curls. "She's strong, sweetheart," he said, his voice hoarse. "She'll be fine." But the words felt hollow, a prayer more than a promise. He carried Beatrice to her room, easing her onto the canopied bed. The tangled sheets and abandoned stuffed rabbit were stark reminders of the danger she'd faced. He wrapped her in a blanket, her eyes wide and searching. "Stay here," he whispered. "Lock the door. I'm going back for Zuri." Beatrice nodded, her small hand clutching his for a moment longer before letting go. He locked the door behind him, his resolve hardening. He couldn't lose Zuri, not after she'd risked everything for his daughter. As he turned back toward the attic stairs, a thud echoed from above, followed by a sharp cry. Zuri's voice, fierce but strained. His pulse surged, and he sprinted up the narrow staircase, his shoes slipping on the dusty steps. The attic door hung ajar, its hinges groaning in the wind, seeping through the cracked skylight. Inside, the scene was chaos frozen in a lightning flash. Zuri stood over the intruder, now unmasked, her shears pressed against his throat. His face was pale, sweat slicked, his eyes wide with fear. Blood trickled from a shallow cut on his arm, staining the floorboards. Zuri's chest heaved, her radiant dark skin glowing in the candlelight she'd retrieved, her wavy hair wild, but her gaze steady. "Stay down," she said, her voice low and commanding, the shears unwavering. The man nodded, his hands raised in surrender. Archibald stepped forward, his breath catching. "Zuri," he said, relief flooding him. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her eyes never leaving the intruder. "I'm fine, but he's not talking yet." She pressed the shears closer, drawing a flinch from the man. "Who sent you?" she demanded. "And don't lie, I know you're not working alone." The man swallowed hard, his voice rasping. "Crane, Victor Crane. He paid me to scare Warrington. Take the girl, make him suffer." Archibald's blood ran cold. Victor Crane, his rival, whose threats after a lost deal had seemed like empty bluster. Now they were all too real. "Why Beatrice?" Archibald growled, stepping closer, his fists clenched. "She's a child." The man's eyes darted nervously. "Crane said it'd break you, ruin your name, your empire. He wanted you to feel helpless." His voice cracked, and he glanced at Zuri's shears. "Please, I didn't want to hurt her. Just scare her." Zuri's jaw tightened, her gaze flicking to Archibald. "He's telling the truth about Crane," she said. "But there's more. I saw Mrs. Caldwell leave the back gate unlocked again tonight. She knew someone was coming." Archibald's mind reeled. Mrs. Caldwell, the head housekeeper, had been a fixture in his home for years, her stern efficiency a constant. The idea that she'd betrayed him, endangered his daughter, was a knife to the gut. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zuri's eyes darkened, her voice steady but heavy with memory. "I've been watching her. She's been acting strange for weeks, locking doors early, avoiding the east wing, checking the security monitors when she thought I was gone. I'm used to noticing things, Mr. Warrington. Where I grew up, you had to. My mother worked double shifts, left me alone in a place where every noise could be trouble. I learned to read people, to spot the ones who smiled but lied." Her words carried the weight of her past, years of scraping by in the city's roughest corners, cleaning houses, selling flowers, funding her night classes in landscape design. The staff's cruelty, calling her the dirt girl, spilling coffee grounds on her patio, hadn't broken her. She'd swept up their mess, her face tight with restrained hurt, her focus on the garden she loved. Archibald stared at her, seeing her anew. She wasn't just the gardener he'd overlooked, her hands stained with soil, her presence confined to the roses that impressed his guests. She was a woman who'd survived, who'd seen what he'd missed. "You stayed," he said almost to himself. "You didn't have to, but you stayed." Zuri's gaze softened, but her grip on the shears didn't waver. "I couldn't leave Beatrice alone. Not with this." She nodded toward the intruder, who flinched under her stare. "I tied him up. We need to call the police, but we have to deal with Mrs. Caldwell first. She's still in the house." Archibald nodded, his mind racing. He thought of the staff, their whispers, their disdain for Zuri, the black woman who didn't belong in their world. He'd ignored it, too consumed by his empire to notice the cracks in his home. Now those cracks had nearly cost him his daughter. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice hard. Zuri gestured toward the stairs. "The kitchen, probably. She's been lingering there at night, claiming she's checking inventory. But I saw her near the back gate earlier, before the storm hit." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with purpose. She handed Archibald a length of rope from a nearby trunk. "Tie his hands tighter. We can't risk him getting loose." Archibald bound the intruder's wrists, his movements clumsy but firm. The man groaned but didn't resist, his fight drained by Zuri's ferocity. As they finished, a distant crash echoed from below, glass shattering, sharp against the storm's fading roar. Zuri's head snapped toward the sound, her body tensing. "That's her," she whispered. "She's trying to leave." Archibald's heart surged with a mix of rage and resolve. He thought of Beatrice, safe but shaken, and Zuri, who'd risked everything to protect her. He'd been blind, assuming his wealth could buy loyalty, safety, love. But Zuri, earning less than his monthly wine budget, had seen the truth. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady for the first time that night. Zuri nodded, slipping the shears into her belt and picking up the candelabra. Its flame flickered, casting her face in a glow that made her look both fierce and radiant. She led the way, her steps silent but sure, her instincts guiding them through the mansion's shadows. Archibald followed, his guilt and gratitude intertwining. Zuri had saved his daughter, exposed a betrayal, and awakened him to his failures. As they descended the stairs, the storm's last rumbles faded, but the real danger, Mrs. Caldwell and the truth she hid, still waited below. The storm had finally relented, its furious howls fading to a soft drizzle that pattered against the Warrington mansion's towering windows. Dawn crept through the glass, casting golden streaks across the marble floors, as if the house itself were exhaling after a night of terror. Archibald Warrington stood in the kitchen, his tuxedo rumpled and stained, his hands still trembling from the confrontation with Mrs. Caldwell. The head housekeeper, her stern facade shattered, had confessed to her betrayal, bribed by Victor Crane to leave the back gate unlocked, allowing the intruder access. She'd crumbled under Zuri's unrelenting stare, her excuses dissolving into sobs as the police led her away in handcuffs. The masked man, Crane's hired thug, was already in custody, his threats silenced. But it was Zuri, the gardener with radiant dark skin and cascading wavy hair, who lingered in Archibald's mind, her courage the anchor that had held his fracturing world together. He leaned against the granite counter, the kitchen's sterile gleam a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. Beatrice sat at the breakfast nook, her small frame wrapped in a blanket, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly. Her eyes, still red from tears, followed Zuri as she moved quietly, brewing tea with a steadiness that belied the ordeal. The scent of chamomile filled the air, a fragile promise of calm. Archibald watched Zuri, her hands calloused from years of tending roses, now pouring hot water with the same care she gave her garden. He'd never noticed her before. Not really. She'd been a shadow, her work a backdrop to his opulent life. But now he saw her, the woman who'd faced a killer, exposed a traitor, and saved his daughter. "Zuri," he said, his voice rough but soft, "sit down, please." She glanced at him, her dark eyes wary but warm, and set the teapot down. She took a seat across from Beatrice, her wavy hair catching the morning light, framing her face like a halo. Beatrice reached out, her small hand brushing Zuri's, and the gardener smiled, a rare, radiant curve of her lips that made the room feel alive. "I'm okay, Beatrice," Zuri said gently, squeezing the girl's hand. "You're safe now." Beatrice nodded, her eyes shining with trust, and Archibald felt a pang in his chest. His daughter had found solace in Zuri, a woman he'd overlooked while he'd been absent, chasing deals and power. The guilt was sharp, but it was tempered by a growing resolve, a promise to be better, to be present. He cleared his throat, his fingers tracing the edge of the counter. "Zuri, I owe you everything," he said, meeting her gaze. "You saved Beatrice. You saw what I didn't. Crane, Caldwell, the danger. I've been blind, assuming money could fix everything. I was wrong." Zuri's expression softened, but she shook her head. "You don't owe me, Mr. Warrington. I did what I had to. Beatrice needed someone, and I was there." Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of her past years in the city's roughest corners, scraping by on odd jobs, from cleaning houses to selling flowers, to fund her dreams of landscape design. The staff's cruelty, calling her the dirt girl, spilling coffee grounds on her patio, hadn't broken her. She'd swept up their mess, her face tight with restrained hurt, her focus on the garden she loved. That resilience, that quiet strength, had saved his daughter. Archibald leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I want you to stay, not just as a gardener. I need someone who sees his house, sees Beatrice, the way you do. I'm offering you a new role, managing the gardens, overseeing security. You've earned it, and a raise, enough to make things easier." He hesitated, then added, "I want you to feel like part of this family." Zuri's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She glanced at Beatrice, who grinned, her small hand still in Zuri's. "Please stay," Beatrice whispered, her voice a plea. Zuri's smile returned, softer now, and she nodded. "I'll stay," she said, "but I'm keeping my hands in the dirt. The garden's my peace. It's where I'm me." Archibald nodded, a warmth spreading through him. He thought of the garden, its roses, its hedges, a masterpiece he'd taken credit for without knowing the hands that shaped it. Zuri's hands, calloused and steady, had turned his estate into a haven. Now they'd turned his house into a home. "Then it's settled," he said. "But call me Archibald. No more Mr. Warrington." Zuri's laugh was soft, almost shy, but it lit the room. "All right, Archibald," she said, testing the name. Beatrice giggled, the sound like music after the night's terror. Archibald felt his chest loosen, the weight of his failures easing, replaced by a fragile hope. The morning unfolded slowly, the mansion waking to a new rhythm. Archibald canceled his meetings, his secretary's shot crackling through the phone. He sat with Beatrice at the breakfast nook, helping her spread jam on toast, his fingers clumsy but earnest. She laughed at his mess, and he laughed too, the sound foreign but welcome. Zuri moved quietly, clearing dishes, her presence a steady undercurrent. She caught his eye, offering a faint smile, and he returned it, seeing her not as a gardener, but as a guardian, a woman whose strength had reshaped his world. Later, he walked Beatrice to the garden, her small hand in his. Zuri was already there, kneeling among the roses, her shears glinting as she trimmed a wayward stem. The garden was alive, its colors vibrant against the storm-washed sky. Beatrice ran to Zuri, dropping to her knees beside her. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice bright. Zuri handed her a small trowel, her smile radiant. "Always," she said. "We'll plant something new today." Archibald watched them, his heart swelling. He thought of Zuri's past, her mother's double shifts, her nights alone, listening for danger. She'd carried that weight, turned it into strength, and now she was sharing it with his daughter. The staff's cruelty, their mocking whispers, faded in the face of her resilience. She'd swept up their mess, not just in the garden, but in his home, and he was determined to make it right. He joined them, kneeling awkwardly in the dirt, his suit traded for a sweater. Beatrice giggled as he fumbled with a bulb, and Zuri guided his hands, her touch gentle but firm. "Like this," she said, showing him how to press the bulb into the soil. "Give it room to grow." Her words felt like a promise, not just for the garden, but for them all. The mansion no longer felt like a cold monument to his wealth. Laughter echoed in its halls, crumbs littered the breakfast nook, and the garden bloomed with new life. Archibald looked at Zuri, her wavy hair catching the sunlight, her hands steady in the earth. She'd given him back his daughter, his home, and a piece of himself he'd lost. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but fierce. "For everything." Zuri met his gaze, her eyes warm. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." And as Beatrice's laughter rang out, Archibald knew she was right. The mansion was a home now, fragile but real, built on the strength of a woman who'd turned dirt into beauty and fear into hope. As the sun sets on the Warrington mansion, now a true home filled with warmth and hope, we leave Zuri, Archibald, and Beatrice to their new beginning. This story of courage, redemption, and unexpected bonds has woven its way into our hearts, and we hope it's touched yours too. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moved you most? Where are you listening from? And what time of day is it? Your voices mean the world to us. Thank you for joining this journey, for staying through the storm to find the light. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that stir the soul. Until we meet again, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep listening.